Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Daanish TV's English language channel. And today it's my great pleasure to have a dear friend, very well-known journalist, and someone who has certainly electrified, the media by her writings. And really challenged and unsettled mainstream orthodoxy on so many issues. And this is why precisely we've been so desperate to have her on here. And I'm speaking of our guest, Rania Khalek. Welcome, Rania, to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm so happy to be with you. Finally.
Yes, finally. No, I was just saying to her earlier that, of course, she's the most wanted, in a good way, journalist in the world, and so we're very pleased to finally get her here. So, Rania, it's great to have you here, and of course, we have limited time, and I wish I could just pick your brain about everything that you've written about for the past 10, 20 years or whatever, but we will try to focus on a couple of central themes that the whole world really is confronting right now. And I think that in particularly here in Pakistan, but not just in Pakistan, throughout the world, there is a deep interest in a couple of very pressing, dangerous issues that we confront. So one is the American election. And that's more because, look, I mean, although it does get tiring, I'm sure for you as well, this saga that started since November 3rd about what's going on. The fact of the matter is the United States is an empire, and we all throughout the world have to be concerned about what's going on there. We just have to be, there's like genetically we have to be obsessed with what's going on. So what I'd like you to kind of speak about is not just specifically kind of the melodrama around what Trump is doing right now in terms of, not conceding and trying to postpone this as much as he can. And I mean, do speak and give your kind of assessment, predictions, or what's going to happen in that sense as well. But also a little bit about, I'll say it up front. I mean, it's not that I'm like ideologically neutral here, but also kind of the moral and political bankruptcy of the Democratic Party that, still allows this guy to get about 71 million votes, and of course has given him 4 years to be in office, and much of those years being spent on trying to claim that he's basically Putin's agent sitting in the White House. This whole Russiagate story. So let's start off from there, and so that we can move quickly from America to what America does abroad, to what America does abroad. We're talking about internally right now. So please, Rania, just reflections on what's going on.
So it's interesting, you have this figure in Donald Trump who's been president for 4 years. He's one of the most unpopular presidents in history. There was this pandemic that he completely botched the response to, and like 200,000 Americans have died completely needlessly. And I mean, the Democrats were basically handed a victory. Had there not been COVID-19, I actually don't think the Democrats would have won the presidency. That said, the Democrats lost in 2016 in a huge upset. Nobody expected Donald Trump to win because there was this very strong anti-establishment sentiment across the country for many reasons. And it was on both sides of the political spectrum. And you saw it on the left with the support you saw for Bernie Sanders. And then you saw it on the right with the support for Donald Trump, who's like this con man who portrays himself as this like anti-establishment figure when he's just like this egomaniacal jerk who cares only about himself. But that, I mean, based on that sentiment, Donald Trump was able to win the presidency over an incredibly unpopular and unlikable candidate, Hillary Clinton, who had this very hawkish history, very corporate history. And it was really emblematic of why so much of the country didn't vote for the Democratic Party and doesn't, isn't enthusiastic about the Democratic Party, because we just have these two parties that are like the same with small differences. They're both, they're both funded by the same corporations, the same weapons companies, the same lobbyists. The only difference is they have different cultural ideologies. The Democrats are more, superficially inclusive, when it comes to like diversity and, rights for women, right? LGBTQ rights, things that are important, but very like substance level stuff. And then the Republicans are very much like religious zealots, very, culturally conservative. And so that's really the main difference between them. Other than that, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to foreign policy, there's very few differences between these two parties. Moreover, there's very few differences between these two parties in the sense that has an actual material impact on people's lives. So the Democrats, everything I just mentioned is what the Democrats should have been talking about in 2016. When they lost to Hillary Clinton, right? They should have been like reflecting on, okay, why did we lose an election we should have won against this con man, this clown? And what did we do wrong? And instead, their entire narrative was to blame Russia. Right? They spent 4 years saying Russia got Trump elected. Trump is in collusion with Putin. The Russians, Trump has been in collusion with the Russians since the 80s. Like just crazy conspiracy theories that sadly, like the Democratic electorate in the U.S. bought into. And they spent 4 years hammering with him with this, and it went nowhere, of course, because there was no evidence of it. Now they don't really talk about it anymore.
I mean, besides the investigation, we look at CNN, MSNBC. It was like every single day bombarded by Russia. And we were just like, what is the obsession with this country, with Russia? So,
well, it's not even just, look, there's no evidence this happened. We know that this was completely like fabricated claim that the Hillary Clinton campaign basically like manufactured in order to like excuse their loss, their inexcusable loss. Like they should have won that election and they didn't, because they made a lot of mistakes, both in the way they campaigned, as well as just everything about the Democratic Party that I mentioned, like funded by corporations, not having really any sort of material benefit on people's lives, these kinds of things. So they jumped on the Russia train for 4 years instead of reflecting. And here we are in 2020. And Joe Biden won this election. But, what's funny is that you have the Republican Party now trying to excuse this loss by saying there was voter fraud, which is completely untrue, right? It's just like completely untrue, made up claim. But in my eyes, they look just as ridiculous as Democrats looked for the last 4 years, trying to blame Trump's victory on Russia. But no one's really seeing it that way. Also, the other funny thing
and many people think that this is almost a form of revenge, Trump, what happened to him, for not only before the elections, but of course throughout most of his period in office, is now kind of, he gets a little bit of a chance of a couple of months to do his revenge drama. Many people do think that as well. Yeah, exactly,
which is what he's doing. And the other interesting, observation I'll make about this whole fiasco in the aftermath of this election is it's also ironic to see Donald Trump try to deploy the same strategy the U.S. empire uses against basically socialist countries. Like the same strategy of claiming voter fraud where there is none to try and delegitimize a legitimate victory. Like they do it, and the Democrats do it too. The Democrats jump on board whenever the U.S. does that to Venezuela or Bolivia. So it's like a little bit funny to see Donald Trump kind of like deploying that internally on the US, but of course it's not going to work. Joe Biden's going to be president. But again, like the issue here is that, so the Democrats won, it's like the same corporate backed party. Nothing has changed. Their policies are the same. Joe Biden's making these cabinet appointments that we can talk more about. But like basically it's just the same establishment, recycling the same people, and not really changing anything. So what's going to happen in 4 years is you're going to be right back where we were in 2016, except it's going to create space for a demagogue, I think, even more effective than Trump to come along and win across the country, because nothing in people's lives is going to change. Like the same sort of economic precarity that's created the space for demagogues like Trump to come along and use it to their advantage is still there. And Democrats aren't going to do anything to address that.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is what it's in some ways it seems like it's happening actually right now when you see the Biden the President-elect Biden, the cabinet that, as you were mentioning, that he's choosing. I mean, these are kind of militarist hawks, establishment characters from corporate America and so on. So even before he's elected, there was the argument that, okay, we have to get Biden in, get Trump out at all costs so that we can push him to get kind of, a more left-wing progressive elements. And it's like right from the get-go, that it's like a no way, Jose. We're not even going down that path. And
Yeah.
so you would think that the guy would make at least some kind of at least
Well,
lip service. Yeah.
He has no reason to, because there's a problem, with the American left. And I don't know, I guess when I say left, it's a very big umbrella term, but basically anyone left of center in America in politics, we don't have any power. And so it's really hard to push somebody left when you have no power. And when Bernie Sanders was running against Joe Biden, he had leverage because he had all these supporters that he should have gone to Biden and been like, okay, if you'd agree to do A, B, and C, then I will endorse you.
Exactly.
And instead of doing that, he went and endorsed Biden without asking for anything. And so now we find ourselves in the situation we're in now, where, Biden is appointing, we just found out who he appointed his Secretary of State, this guy, Tony Blinken, who's been a longtime advisor to, first under the Clinton administration, then the Obama administration, longtime advisor to Joe Biden. He actually played a very vital role during the lead up to the Iraq War in helping Joe Biden basically convince other Democratic senators to vote for this war. So once again, you're going to have an administration staffed with people who helped give us the Iraq War, which was the biggest, I think, crime of the century, among others. No one's paid for, and we still have the same people who gave it to us in charge. But this is the guy who's going to be secretary.
Fact, exactly. This is what I was going to. I mean, beyond the kind of the hawks and the elements from corporate America and the cabinet, Biden himself, his own record going back. I mean, it's it's not very inspiring as kind of the alternative candidate to Trump. I mean, it was like you could literally, at least in 2016, by this point, because the Democratic Party probably had exposed itself as so kind of politically bankrupt. But in 2016, you could have put a poodle and it should have won against Trump, but it didn't. I mean, and that demonstrated how kind of bankrupt and corrupt the party establishment had become. And right now, I mean, it's like, you have Joe Biden and you kind of erase his history within the Democratic Party of kind of being a cheerleader of all wars.
Every war.
Yeah, exactly.
Every war.
Is kind of his own racism, his own sexism, all of these things, but that's kind of brushed aside because we got Trump out,
Right. And now it's going to be interesting to see what happens, right? Because for the past 4 years, Democrats like who are in the Joe Biden camp have been saying we have to get rid of Trump because children in cages. There's children in cages. We have to get rid of Trump because there's children in cages. And it's true. I mean, Trump did have a policy of putting children in cages, separating families. But guess where that policy started? It started under Barack Obama. Donald Trump built off a policy that was being implemented and actually expanded under the Obama administration. Nobody cared about children in cages under the Obama administration.
Right.
And so, I'm very skeptical that anyone's going to continue to care about children in cages, which is going to continue to happen under a Joe Biden administration. Moreover, one thing that Democrats and the liberals who support them don't want to reflect on or discuss is the fact that, our foreign policy in the U.S. creates these waves of refugees that need to flee their countries and that end up, being detained and put into, cages, if you will.
Absolutely.
And they never
Which is an old story as well. I mean, from the 80s wars in Central America, it says this is a very old story. It's nothing new. We have a huge refugee crisis today, but I mean, of course, these wars that the U.S. has been involved in since Vietnam
But it's actually like feeding into the far right, because every time one of our regime change operations, whether it's in Honduras, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Syria, causes millions of people to flee to safety, it creates this space for demagogues in the global north to rise. We've seen literally the U.S. did in Libya and Syria. It completely destabilized and destroyed those countries by funding these extremists to try to overthrow the governments and turning these countries into basically places where militias are in
Right,
charge. And
right.
it's unsafe to be.
Where yesterday the U.S. government demanded these Al Qaeda types and these Salafi jihadis. This is a war on terror to fight these guys, and we have to send them to Guantanamo and to Libya and to
But also
Syria
give them weapons. Also give
yeah,
them weapons.
exactly. Right, and to be tortured, etc. Now we actually have to get rid of these Gaddafis and these Assads. So let them out of jail and unleash them and use them to. So it's just so
It's
twisted.
a cycle.
And yeah,
It's
exactly.
a cycle. It's a cycle that continues to justify more and more wars, right? So like they fund these extremists, like they started in the 80s in Afghanistan. They fund these extremists in Syria now. 10 years later, you have 9/11, 15 years later, 9/11 happens. They start, turning their ire on the US. And then that justifies even more war. So you're arming them. Later on, they attack the US. It justifies these like endless counterterrorism wars in like every country in the world. But what's important to recognize, at least in the context of the rise of people like Donald Trump and the rise of far-right parties across Europe, is they are actually capitalizing on the anti-refugee sentiment that happens when these wars take place, because you have this flood of refugees and no one thinks about it in the sense of, our foreign policy is causing it. Just think about it in the sense of, wow, like my quality of life here is going down because of neoliberalism and austerity. And now there's these immigrants coming in and trying to take my job. And people like Donald Trump play on that. They play on that hatred and that fear. And then they end up gaining power. So if liberals really care about preventing
and of course
the rise,
the liberal narrative is like, we should be more charitable, towards these people that are coming.
Yeah, hug
Again,
them, open your arms.
Yeah, exactly. Again, never linking it to the actual foreign policy, the criminality of the foreign policies of the government, but just saying that let's try to be a little bit more charitable than you right-wingers, than you racists and xenophobes, that just want them out. So that is kind of the parameters, the very narrow parameters of the debate.
And it's like if you guys really, really care as liberals about preventing the rise of fascism, then maybe stop destroying other people's countries and stop like cutting public funding for things inside the country. But they won't do that. They just want to in order, because at the end of the day, they're loyal to the people who are funding them. That's why we can't have healthcare in America, because the Democratic Party is loyal to the health insurance industry and pharmaceutical companies. And so like, we're just in this situation where it's like, I feel like after 4 years of Donald Trump, Democrats have done so little to even really like in substance oppose what he's doing, that the country's actually moved right. And now we're stuck, like you mentioned, these parameters. We're stuck between these narrow parameters of not putting people in camps versus status quo of misery, but nothing changes. That's
misery and constant surveillance and this and basically like a police state without concentration camps, right?
A police state that's like waving a rainbow flag. That's what the U.S. is.
Right. Exactly. No, but it's very interesting, and this is something that I think that the whole world and our Pakistani viewership in particular, this. The continuity, the idea that kind of Trump comes in and he's, personally and psychologically, he may be a bit out there, but in terms of the policies, when you're talking precisely about, kids in chains and cages and so on, under Obama has had the title of deporter in chief. When we're talking about Trump being so anti-immigrant, etc., Obama deported more people than any other president ever. And so, these things are forgotten. Drone strikes, invading several Muslim countries, etc. All of this was happening on Obama's watch, assassinating U.S. citizens abroad. No due process, nothing whatsoever. So you set all of these precedents and then you just blame it on Trump. It was kind of like Bush to Obama, and then saying that, Bush was all the problems and Obama is going to fix it. And it's exactly what you're saying, that you turn a blind eye then to Obama. And the fear is that the same thing's going to happen again. Biden will do whatever he wants, launch wars and this, and you just turn a blind eye because the Democrats in power.
And also because Trump was so crazy in like his rhetoric and just did so many unprecedented things in his behavior. Now, because of that, both Democrats and Republicans have managed to actually whitewash presidency of George W. Bush. So now George W. Bush is like considered an endearing, lovely figure to admire. Like, can we have more
Yeah,
Republicans like
incredible.
that? It is incredible.
Incredible. I mean,
And
it's like what you said, the probably the most major crime of this century that has kind of wrecked the entire Middle East, the invasion of Iraq, and at the time, even before the war, the kind of the strong anti-war sentiment and so on. It's kind of whitewashed, and now like Bush looks good, his brother looks good, all these decent adults in the in the room, they all look so nice, in comparison to Trump. But
you
it's
have
such a
Trump
joke.
trying. You have Trump. It's such a joke because right now you have Donald Trump on his way out talking about wanting to withdraw troops from Afghanistan.
From Afghanistan, yeah.
And
Which actually he wanted to do from the beginning, which actually, to be fair, I mean, Trump wanted to do that in the beginning. Yeah, I mean, this is a kind of a debate that we've had, like on foreign policy issues. The guy can be a nutcase at times. One day he'll say, "I'm going to blow up North Korea." The next day he's best friends with Kim Jong-un and says that, okay, we should like kind of have some type of peace negotiations. And of course, then the national security state or the deep state intervenes and says, no, you don't understand how we maintain an empire. Okay, sit back. And so, yeah, I mean, in Afghanistan, he actually wanted to do it from the beginning. Now, kind of the national security state has kind of realized, okay, maybe there's not much of a purpose of maintaining a huge presence there, although they'll still keep bases. But in that sense, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, this was one of the platforms that actually that appealed to Americans.
Especially people who are from places in the country that end up having to go fight these endless wars for oil. But it's funny too, because not funny, it's actually kind of frightening, because Donald Trump's I think administration, because of what you talked about, he had this sort of instinct of not wanting to expand and go and invade. And there was a few times he didn't care enough to really make that happen, but there was a few times where he tried. And what you saw is how we do really in the US have this like deep state, this national security state, that no matter what,
which of course we say that only these third world backward countries like Pakistan.
No. America is like where they got the idea, because we're the original deep state. But you do have this national security establishment that has, I mean, the US empire does what it does. It's written in stone. It's going to be done no matter who's in charge. The only difference is how it's going to be done. So that means there's no space for reducing troop presence. There's no space for ending a war, unless, of course, America wants to shift and have a war elsewhere. That's the only time a war can end, is if they've like kind of gotten everything they can out of it. But at the end of the day, like the times that Donald Trump actually did try to reduce a troop presence, not only the national security establishment, deep state, whatever you want to call it, came out and opposed it, but you also had the media in the US, which is basically run by those same people. They're all analysts, right? These national security people work at MSNBC, they work at CNN, and they go on a blitz on TV, 24/7.
And Rania, aligned with the Democratic Party, with the New York Times, with the Washington Post. I mean, this is the kind of bizarre scenario under Trump. You have this these so-called adversarial journalism. I mean, they were pretty much, the same narrative coming out of the intelligence military apparatus from the Democratic Party and from these major organs of the empire, the New York Times and the Washington Post.
I mean, at this point, they should just let the State Department and Pentagon write their articles, honestly, because most of what they turn out is just like press releases for the Pentagon. But I also think that what you've had because of Donald Trump being in office and having this sort of like isolation, like having this sort of like instinct towards isolationism, is you had a lot of the neoconservatives that were formerly like embedded in the Republican Party actually move over to the Democratic Party. Right. Now the Democratic Party, I think, not to say the Republican Party is an anti-war party, it's not. But the Democratic Party has certainly become the home of all the people who started the Iraq War.
Incredible.
Almost all of them are like in the Democratic Party now. They call themselves Never Trump Republicans. Some of them have even switched their party affiliations. And then you have the people that Biden's appointed so far, like to his administration. They're basically like neocons. They're liberal interventionists who have that same ideology of like American exceptionalism. They actually do want to make America great again. They want to make American empire great again.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like when Obama came, we need a new chief executive, a commander in chief that can steer, that can resuscitate the empire that George Bush's policies were undermining. And it's the same kind of logic behind this. Absolutely.
And they're trying to put a pretty face, and just they did under the Obama administration, giving us like a first Black president, putting this like black face on American empire. Which
I
is
don't know
actually
about Biden. I don't know about.
Well, he has it. So Biden is doing it. I mean, he has this. For the vice president is Kamala Harris, right? She's in fact she's half Black, half Indian. And they're playing that up, right? They're trying to put this like veneer of progressivism through identity, to try to like make the world
through
think,
only
like
identity. My gosh, I mean, what record does she have to show for?
I mean, come on. And then you have, they're going to appoint the first woman Secretary of Defense, Michelle Flournoy, who's a huge hawk, who helps convince Obama to intervene in Libya. She basically like works in the revolving door. She goes from weapons company to government back to, I mean, she sits on the board of one of the biggest weapons companies in the country, Boozdale and Hamilton, right now. So she just goes back and forth and then makes money off of her time at the Pentagon and, the private sector. And now she's coming back. And they're going to say, oh, it's the first woman Secretary of Defense. This means America is like making progress, when it's just the same old racist imperialist policy, but in heels.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. Rania, before I want to get to the larger issue of, we'll kind of conclude with that, about the general regime change approach of the U.S. national security state, what it's doing left, right, and center. Folks know the incredible and the horrendous criminality that was involved in the invasion of Iraq and kind of what it unleashed in the Middle East. But one of the points, one of the issues that I know that you have covered extensively and have gotten a lot of praise for. No, I'm joking. I
won awards.
Won awards for it. Certainly got praise from about 2-3 people here in Pakistan, 2-3 people there. But that was, of course, the coverage of Syria. I mean, we have seen, I mean, in my humble opinion, I've seen nothing like it, other than kind of one can compare it to the way kind of the Zionist coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. But we have, not even kind of the Iraq war was, of course, a piece of cake. The media kind of just. But on the Syria thing, it was just like from the right to the left to the ultra. Everyone was kind of in agreement that this regime change operation must happen, no matter who we support. And they didn't even really want to investigate that exactly who is actually fighting or anything. They just knew it's a horrible regime. And of course, one of the persons at the forefront of kind of opposing this was, of course, this Assadist known as Rania Khalek.
As they like to call me, the Assadist.
These demeaning terms that they had for anyone that raised some questions about, wait a second, weren't these the guys that we were supposed to be fighting, this war on terror?
Al-Qaeda's our friends now? What?
Yeah, right, exactly, right. That we're supporting having this kind of rat line from Turkey to go into Syria. So, I mean, just very briefly, I mean, can you just speak about the horrendous kind of nonstop consensus coverage from all over the Western media, even in the Middle East, even at times Al Jazeera, so on this question of Syria? I mean, what explained that?
So no, I mean, I think you explained. I think you summarized it very well. And I think what happened with Syria, which I think is something that should be studied. Like academics should study this, because it's fascinating. It's also quite frightening. Is you had not only like normal propaganda being pumped out about this war, but you had all of this money coming from the U.S. and Europe and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE to fund civil society activist groups inside Syria to like produce media. They funded the Syrian opposition to produce media. The State Department and UK Foreign Office specifically spent a lot of money on this, as well as like various oligarchs across the Middle East. Like there's like a man with the name Asfari who is a billionaire who funded the Syria campaign, which was largely responsible for doing the PR for the white helmets. So you had all of this money, millions and millions and millions of dollars being
That's right.
pumped in to produce media from Syria, while at the same time, the people in these opposition areas in Syria were extremist groups. They were groups that if you were a journalist and came to try to cover what was happening in these areas, you might be kidnapped. You might be sold to a different militia, or even ISIS, you might be killed. So, So like media around the world had to rely on what was coming out of these places because they couldn't send their own journalists who might be killed if they go there. So they were regurgitating what they were getting from these Western and Gulf state funded media groups inside Syria. And that was what was like pushing the whole narrative. It was a lack of information as well as a flood of propaganda. And I think this is the first time where the Western world has, or the Western countries, the Western governments have managed to really successfully use social media to their benefit, from Twitter to Facebook to YouTube, to push their propaganda line using all of this media that they were funding. And then they were all consuming that media. So like, it was funny, the US State Department would fund, you know, media organizations in Syria that was really just PR for various extremist groups. And then they would then US officials would then consume that media and believe what they were hearing from the media they were funding. And then of course, like, you know, you go to any major outlet with journalists. I mean, I live in Beirut, Lebanon. Most of the people covering Syria were not covering it from Syria. They were covering it from Beirut, and they were covering it from Turkey. Because like I mentioned, if they went to Idlib or they went to East Aleppo, they might be kidnapped or killed. So they would depend on these US and European funded groups on the ground claiming to be media for what they would write from Istanbul or Gaziantep or from Beirut, right? So, and I think there was something similar to this happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where a lot of journalists were actually based in Pakistan and would just kind of like, you know, regurgitate like US propaganda coming out of Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
But I think with Syria, it was much, much worse because at least journalists could actually go to Afghanistan in the 1980s and not get like kidnapped and killed. Whereas in Syria, people were getting sold to ISIS and beheaded. So I think that's what happened. And I also think there was so much money being spent on smearing people who work at these think tanks in the US. Whether that receive money from NATO and the State Department, whether it's the Atlantic Council or
the Gulf countries, absolutely,
or the Gulf countries like the Middle East Institute. These people were dedicated to spending all their time just smearing anybody who questioned this war. So you immediately become an Assadist, you immediately become a dictator apologist and a genocide denier. And if you repeat these things about somebody enough times, people don't look into it themselves. They just see it being said. And eventually, if enough people say it, they'll assume it's true. So it was like smearing and attacking the messenger, which is an age-old tactic, mixed in with this like funding so much propaganda. I mean, the last thing I'll say about this is there was a friend of mine who worked at like Al Jazeera at the time, but he received like a job offer to make $17,000 a month writing opposition group propaganda from Gaziantep, like to go move to Gaziantep, write propaganda that's pro-opposition in Syria, and it was funded by the UK Foreign Office. That's how much money they were spending on this stuff. I mean, who's going to say no to $17,000 a month? That's a huge salary to write propaganda. So that's my analysis.
I thought that's how much you were earning, Rania, for your great journalism. Huh?
I mean, people were saying, oh, Assad's paying all these people, but like Syria's under sanction. Even if the government wanted to pay people, they couldn't.
They couldn't,
But this is like, even now, you even had the involvement of like Netflix and Hollywood got involved in pushing propaganda, making these like movies about Aleppo, glorified the opposition without telling you that they're linked to Al Qaeda, like glorifying, you know,
they're
the white
moderate rebels,
over and over again. And so the reason I think it's so important for people to actually go look back at this is because this is the future of war. This is what we're going to see, this same sort of like strategy replicated in other places in the world where the US tries to to do something similar. I mean, this is an age-old tactic of the U.S. is basically they funded right-wing death squads in Syria, just like they've done in Latin America, just like they've done across the Middle East and Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, but what you have is you have this new sort of added aspect to it, which is the propaganda war. And I think that Syria was really an experiment and how to like perfect that. And they did a really good job. I mean, I even myself went to Syria. Like, didn't even matter that I actually went there. Like, there's no way. It's like, there's no way. And you're right. It was like, I mean, this was so effective that from left to right, like no one would question it. It was like really frightening.
No, I mean, you know, and the fact is, like, it wasn't even considered kind of what you're writing, what you're saying, etc. It's like I said, the immediate label before even a word or a sentence of yours is read, it's like, okay, this is an Assadist. I mean, no one denied that, of course, people wanted like more democracy, more economic kind of justice in the country, etc. And then there may have been initial kind of protests that were kind of part of a broader Arab Spring that wanted to have a more just society. But the fact that one can provide this enormous amount of evidence that within weeks that this was entirely hijacked by all of these kind of governments, from the West to the Gulf to the US and NATO and etc. And all of these forces, you know, this rat line started. And then you expect, you know, you're kind of like, okay, well, why aren't the Syrian people so excited about these great rebels that are coming to fight and support them to overthrow Assad? I mean, it like totally blows my mind why people can't understand that, okay, fine, we may not like Assad, but you really want to put us under these guys, you know, that are coming?
It's also,
it's
you know,
simple.
It is simple. And there are people who started to understand what's happening, but they were scared to say anything publicly because they saw what happened to people like me, right? If you see someone being branded as like an evil person and being relentlessly attacked, like you know, it's like you don't want to put yourself in that same position. I mean, I think that the issue of Syria became more detrimental to one's career if you spoke the truth about it than even speaking the truth about Palestine.
Wow. That says a lot.
A lot. I mean, it was the same forces, like the Israel lobby in the U.S.
Precisely. This is one of the things I point out. I mean, why is it the case that the same forces that are so heavily involved in the Zionist propaganda and the brutalization of the Palestinians are so involved in this? I mean, shouldn't that make kind of people that are genuinely have been involved in the Palestine solidarity movement kind of ask some questions at least about like what's their motivation? But nothing was asked.
Yeah, and it's the same people who recognize that CNN and the New York Times cannot be trusted to be honest with you about what's happening in Israel Palestine.
Right.
Yet somehow everything they say about Syria, you're just supposed to like accept. It's absurd, and that should have made people think twice. But unfortunately, one of the other issues in the U.S. is that a lot of activism in the U.S. as anti-war or pro-Palestine, Arab Americans are deeply involved in this activism. And on the issue of Syria, Arab Americans were extremely fractured. Because I think the issue of Syria really sectarianized Arabs in America, not just in the Middle East. So for the first time, you had Arabs in America looking at themselves as Sunni or Shia or like Christian. And that was never a thing in the US. Like that was not a thing.
I mean, the same thing happened in Iraq, and the same thing that these empires do everywhere, actually. Yeah, the same thing happened in Iraq before the invasion. Despite the political kind of whatever grievances, they were living together, Sunni Shias, intermarrying, etc., so on. Now you have fully ethnically cleansed, you know.
You have segregated, completely segregated towns in Iraq, like completely segregated villages. They can't like live together anymore. And in the US, it became like an issue of like Sunni nationalism, because also like a lot of people were consuming Al Jazeera as like the trusted source in the Middle East, because they did a lot of really good stuff on Palestine when no other outlets were. And the Iraq War too, although in retrospect, they portrayed Al-Qaeda in Iraq a bit too heroically in the beginning days. But regardless, they were considered this like legitimate outlet that Arab Americans can kind of trust. And then once the war in Syria started, it just became this outlet for Sunni nationalism. And that really did impact the way that Arabs in America saw themselves. So this goes into the Palestine solidarity movement. all these white people and these like anti-Zionist Jews who are in the Palestine Solidarity Movement were like, well, we don't know who to listen to. Like, which Arab Americans do we listen to?
Right. Exactly.
They were really confused about it. So that caused a lot of fractures. And of course, the better funded side won, the side that wanted regime change.
Right. I mean,
won that argument.
It was so interesting to see. I mean, and so disturbing, actually. The way in outlet like Al Jazeera and others, so the way they, for example, perceived Hezbollah, before, in 2006, someone like Yusuf al-Qaradawi there, all praising, what the Hezbollah has done to defend the country. And now all of a sudden kind of denouncing them, for God's sake, even within Lebanon itself, protecting Lebanon from ISIS and this type of thing. Hezbollah fighters there, but no, I mean, they're there just basically to prop up this dictator, and the Russians are doing the same, and the Iranians. It was just such a distorted coverage of this story.
And in Arabic, it was even worse. Like in Arabic, the coverage of Hezbollah and anything that was Shia, especially at Al Jazeera, it became like a channel that promoted like Shia genocide. Al Jazeera in Arabic, it did. It was like worse than Fox News. In the Middle East, but people, of course, didn't really understand that. But these Gulf state-funded channels played a huge role in pushing, because the Middle East, obviously, like we all know, that like Arabs in the Middle East used to be much more united in how they viewed Israel, Palestine, how they viewed the region, and now it's died down a bit in the last few years because that war has died down. But at the same time, like people's minds 20 years ago, 10 years ago versus today is so much more, their mind frame is so much more affiliated with their sect than it ever was. And it's a disturbing trend.
This is the imperial Zionist and Muslim Zionists, but Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis and so on. I mean, this is the game that they play. These the only response that they have to serious political questions is to sectarianize them, is to make them kind of a sectarian issue. Okay, well, it's the Sunnis versus the Shias, and this is what it's about, the Shia expansionism towards, and if we don't respond in this way, they're just going to come and take us over. So this is, and I argue this has happened since 1979. These monarchies, these dictatorships in the Gulf, they have no political response, and so what they do is that they just sectarianize it. So when Hassan Nasrallah was the most popular Arab leader in 2006, that was just intolerable for the Sunni monarchical regimes, and then they again have to whip up the sectarian card. These Shia, the hatings of the Sahabas, of the companions of the Prophet, and they whip out all of this kind of rhetoric in order to then once again make it this type of sectarian conflict, again to kind of depoliticize what's actually going on in these areas. That's been an old game. But Ronnie, I got you enough on Syria, and I think that again, I just want to tell everyone that Rania is one of the few ones that have taken, paid a huge toll in terms of the slander and defamation campaigns left, right, and center. But
honestly,
she's also,
I was used to it from the Israel issue. It just shifted to Syria. Right.
Just shifted to Syria. Yeah. And by the way, the Afghanistan thing is, I'm glad you pointed it out, because whenever I'd be speaking, I'd be saying, and this was kind of even, from the very get-go in Syria, I'd be like, look, for us and here in Pakistan, this is like a repeat. This is like Afghanistan.
Yeah, you guys know better than anyone, because it had a huge impact on.
It's like a horrible. It's like a movie that was horrible it's like a horrible sequel to that movie. That happened in Afghanistan. It was like literally the same things going on from the outside.
They literally copy and pasted. They copy and pasted.
Precisely.
Pakistan was like,
and you see the effects of that. After the effects are all, I mean, like
until today,
Syria, exactly. Syria, which I say, barely any trace of kind of Wahhabi Salafism. And then 10, 20 years later, you'll be saying, oh wow, where are all these Wahhabis? And it's such a there's a history to it. There are forces that supported these groups, It doesn't come out of nowhere. Exactly. So the final thing, Rania, that I want to ask you about is the question of what's been going on in, of course, Libya and Syria, but also in Latin America, where we've been seeing it very heavily. And that is this kind of these regime change operations, hybrid warfare, and also maybe ending on kind of a hopeful note in terms of also the lack of kind of success of the U.S. in achieving what they wanted to say in Venezuela. Certainly in Bolivia, kind of a very hopeful victory by the
Yes.
Mass Party as well. So maybe a little bit about that, what's been going on there.
So in Latin America, the U.S., you mentioned hybrid warfare. The U.S. has really turned to this warfare where they fund these civil society groups that are really just like right-wing groups to destabilize the country, and it's usually funded by like USAID under the auspices of supporting human rights or supporting democracy. Or the National Endowment for Democracy. They pump millions of dollars in these countries that have governments that they dislike, like Bolivia. Venezuela is a huge one. They did it in Honduras. And they also did it in Brazil to some degree and largely contributed to the rise of Bolsonaro. But this sort of warfare we've seen, it started under Obama, and it was continued under Donald Trump, though Donald Trump really cranked it up to a high degree. And we saw him attempt to basically take out the government in Venezuela by funding a parallel right-wing government and having Juan Guaido declare himself president. And it didn't work. Maduro's still in charge of Venezuela. The same sort of similar tactics did not work in Bolivia, like you mentioned. The U.S. successfully helped overthrow the government of Evo Morales last year. But then we saw this mass party, the Movement for Socialism, and Bolivia actually won the elections this year, despite a year of U.S.-backed fascists being in charge of the country. And so I think what you're seeing with what's taken place in Latin America and the sort of failures for regime change under Trump, I think that has to do with a weakening of U.S. empire. There's other countries that are, I think, becoming more, I don't want to say like aggressive, but standing up to the American bully more than they did before. America wreaked so much havoc in Libya and Syria, and Russia and China have had like enough of it.
Enough of it, yeah, exactly.
Enough of it, right? Like, because China,
that's what I often say. Like after Libya, it was kind of like Russia and China said enough of this. No. You know, they're going to use like any pretext. Oh, we're just establishing a no-fly zone in Libya or something to basically engage in regime change. So so I really do think that I agree with you. They said enough of this, you know?
And it's destabilizing, right? It's destabilizing on a number of fronts. For Russia, it's actually destabilizing in their own backyard because, you know, Russia has a history of extremists, you know, doing terrorist attacks in Russia.
Absolutely.
And so it actually poses a huge threat for the U.S. to be funding extremism so close to Russia's borders, like in Syria.
I've often said this. I've often said that it's. I mean, and it's not that that crimes have not been committed or war crimes and that type of thing. But at the very least, the Russians have been very consistent and principled in opposing kind of these extremist groups. Now, sometimes they may go on and carry on collective punishment, which maybe have a lot of kind of civilian casualties and so on. That's deplorable to find. But the point is, they've been very consistent on this question. Unlike the United States, which one day, we're waging a war on terror, and the next day we'll be supporting these same.
We're supporting the terrorists. Again.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's also something to be said. War is disgusting or leads to atrocities. It leads to collective punishment. The way to stop that is to not keep it going. And that's what the U.S. has continued to try to do in Syria for the last decade, is keep the war going. But with Latin America, Venezuela has these allies in China and Russia that has given them kind of like a lifeline. It's also,
and in some ways the same with Iran. I mean, the pressure was coming, the sanctions. I mean, just deplorable. Also in the middle of the pandemic, which hit Iran. That hit Iran very hard early on and continues to. As many sanctions they can put on the country, they continue to do. So, I mean, the Chinese massive investment now in Iran is also kind of, really a lifesaver in that sense. And again, points to something what you're talking about, that people are not going to these other countries now, big or even not so big, they're not going to follow those rules anymore, the rules of the mafia don in world affairs like they used to. Yeah.
Right. And I think that like COVID, I don't think the US empire is like about to be finished, but I do think it's sort of like experiencing somewhat of decline. And I think Donald Trump actually helped accelerate that decline. But I also believe that COVID helped accelerate the decline to a degree, because what the world saw was they saw China was able to contain and handle their virus outbreak, and the U.S. has just been an abysmal failure. And also you have like this points to actually what you're going to see in a Biden administration is you're going to see all of these regime change schemes continue in the Middle East, continue in Venezuela and Bolivia and these Latin American countries, but just like in a more undercover kind of human rights promoting kind of way. But you're also going to see the U.S. shifting more towards this great power competition with China, which it's already started to do. But I don't know how many tools the U.S. has in its box when it comes to China, because the Chinese, one of the biggest areas that the U.S. is losing in is the future of communications. China's like way ahead of the U.S. in 5G technology. The U.S. is a huge threat. It's even running around the world, like bullying other countries, saying, if you buy China's 5G technology, like we're going to take things away from you. It's literally what the U.S. is doing. But I mean, there's some interesting things happening. Like you have this recent trade deal made like, like 2 weeks ago, I think.
This Southeast Asian, absolutely.
It involves 15 countries. Global trade. Absolutely, involves like 15 countries, not 15 including the
countries.
US.
And the interesting thing is that one would have expected that the American kind of, the American allies would have stayed out of it, but actually Japan, South Korea joined, Australia joined. I mean, it was incredible. Like, where did these countries come from? But yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, I think that's what you're going to see. I think the big shift under a Biden administration is going to be like, how do we take on China? The great power competition with China, and of course Russia as well. But I think China's seen it as like the sort of bigger overall threat to U.S. economic dominance all over the world. And not just that, I think that what's interesting about the U.S.-China rivalry is that China obviously has its problems, but they do business with countries differently than the U.S. does. When they make deals with certain countries, they don't impose their style of governance on other countries. They don't impose conditions like the U.S. does. The U.S. if the U.S. like is going to ally with you on anything, you have to be capitalist. You have to enforce austerity. You have to enforce neoliberalism. China doesn't play that game. They're like, we'll work with Iran. We'll work with Venezuela. Two very different styles of governance, right?
Absolutely.
Well, we're going to build our Belt and Road Initiative and do deals with countries. We don't care. Like, it's like they can govern however they want to. And so in that sense, I think that China poses a threat to the U.S. because it offers this kind of alternative to
very much alternative. I mean, they're interested in trade, interconnectivity. Yeah, exactly. Trade, interconnectivity, infrastructure development. I mean, you don't even hear these things,
no.
in the U.S. It's just about bases and wars. Exactly. Right. Bases and wars. So, I mean, it is, as you say, just a tremendous alternative that's being offered. I mean, and we know this very well because in Pakistan, perhaps has one of the closest relationships, if not the closest relationship, with China on the planet. And so, we know it very well, the difference between the way the U.S. engages with Pakistan and the way that Beijing and China engages with Pakistan. So, no, you're absolutely right.
I mean, I definitely think moving forward, you're going to see that China is going to become the new boogeyman in the U.S. It's been Russia for the past 4 years, but I think it's going to start to be China. And there's also a lot of hate and fear mongering that comes from both parties with respect to China. You have the fight.
A lot of racism involved there. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So it's Cold War 2.0. What that means for the rest of the world still stands to be seen. I mean, I'm not sure how that's going to manifest because, I mean, China's also, I can't imagine China fighting proxy wars with the U.S. around the globe.
Right.
So we'll have to see how it plays out. But definitely, for the rest of the world, you're talking about people sitting around kind of watching the U.S. election because it has such an impact on everyone around the world of what's going to happen. I don't think foreign policy wise that much is going to change, except it might just be a little bit more consistent. That's it.
You may get the Europeans, back on board in terms of being on friendly terms with the U.S. and having multilateral invasions rather than
Yes,
unilateral.
exactly. The coalition of the willing to take out countries rather than just America doing it on its own.
Right. But I'm glad that we also touched upon these kind of spaces of hope that have emerged. Certainly in Latin America, once again resisting, and of course in other parts of the world, and kind of alternative blocs forming to resist. And what we thought. I mean, right now, in some ways, one of the most really fascist governments is the one next door to us that has kind of controlled the levers of power. And we're talking about India, the Modi regime in India, which is actually a fascist movement that began from the 1920s. But of course, it's seen its limitations as well. I mean, it's like the outlier nation in Asia right now. Like, while everyone else is kind of trying to be a part of this kind of alternative bloc, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, get better relations with Russia and China, and so on. While India is becoming basically a satellite state for the United States in its attempt to contain China, and that's not been so successful. China has not had to fire a bullet and has humiliated India now twice. The Pakistanis, which are obviously a much weaker country militarily, have also humiliated the Indians last February. So that's not going too well either. So these are some of the spaces of hope that we can look forward to.
Keep our eyes on. Yeah, the space of hope is the fall of fascism in India.
Exactly.
The failure of fascism in India.
Right. But Rania, I took way more time than I asked you for, and yes, way more time. But I'm so thankful and so grateful.
No, this was lovely. I'm sorry it took so long to make it happen, but I'm glad that we got to do it.
No, I'm very glad, and I hope we can have you back again when hopefully another regime change war may happen that we may have to cover again. But hopefully it won't. But most likely it will. But thanks so much, Rania, and everyone. I mean, I'm sure they gained so much from your insights, because very few people say the things you do, and keep doing it, please.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. It was great to be on with you.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.